Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. The topics that I'm going to be covering are planning and evaluating public engagement impact. So today we'll talk about the planning part, and then that will feed naturally into the evaluation part tomorrow. And the thing that underpins both elements is a focus on evidence-based practice and strategic public engagement. So my background is social science, sociology, and communication. And I work at the University of Illinois in the United States. I'm a part-time sociology professor at the University of Warwick, and I write on both science communication and research methods. So those are the kind of main areas that I focus on. And I do a lot of consulting work for public engagement institutions, as well as policy institutions. And that often involves doing evaluation, strategic planning for impact, quite a variety of different things around public engagement and societal impact. So, the first step when we're thinking about strategically planning public engagement for impact is to think about the diversity of impacts that one can have. There are quite a wide range, and there is a tendency for us to kind of foreclose on a more narrow set of impacts based on what we're used to or based on what kind of seems like the normal thing to do. So it's important to kind of keep an open mind about the various ways that you can make a difference, that you can have a societal impact. And these are just a few that I've listed here. So getting started with an evidence-based approach to public engagement means that when you're doing impact planning, you start from the perspective of those that you're trying to develop impact with. So you start from those with whom you're trying to make a difference. And it actually is a little bit more complicated than just audience analysis, although that's really important to think about who is your core audience. It's also important to think about who are the other relevant parties that have a stake in the work that you're doing, in the public engagement that you're developing. And so that may be people who are not in your audience directly, but people who are affected by the work you're doing, people who can boost or block the kind of impact that you're trying to have. So there's a step in impact planning, in evidence-based impact planning, that involves stakeholder analysis, thinking through who are you trying to reach, but also who is affected, who is potentially involved, either interested, could be influential, or could be impacted by the work you're doing. So thinking through potential impact allies and clarifying the opportunities for impact as well as the risks can help you to develop a strategic plan to develop impact. So doing a stakeholder analysis has a number of benefits. It does help you understand your audience better. It helps you understand your pathways to impact better and to clarify what are the steps. So particularly when the kinds of impact you're trying to develop are more complex, like something like societal change or even behavioral change. So going beyond simply imparting knowledge, for example, it starts to get a little bit complicated sometimes for how you develop a pathway to impact that can actually work. It may be multiple steps involved to actually get to the kinds of impact you want to achieve. And so a stakeholder analysis is an excellent starting point for mapping out potential allies, potential risks, potential barriers to impact so that you can start to develop what may be a little bit more complicated plan for how you're going to get to impact than just I'm going to deliver a talk, for example, and people will like it or enjoy it or learn something from it. So a stakeholder analysis also is really helpful for prioritization. It's not possible to develop all the impact that you could all the time. We always have scarce resources. We always have a limited bandwidth. And so it can be very helpful to analyze who the potential people you might want to engage with, people and organizations, and then to prioritize based on where you can make the biggest difference. That's the most often basis for prioritization. So these are some of the benefits of stakeholder analysis, some of the reasons for doing it. And there's a model for doing it called the 3I approach that I've worked on with Professor Mark Reed, who's an expert in research impact, and he's also involved in the policy engagement training program I mentioned at the beginning. So this model focuses on 3 I's: who is interested, who is influential, who could be influenced by your work, and who is impacted. So, for example, if you're trying to change something in a local community, it may be that local policy stakeholders could be influential in your ability to develop a change, even if that societal impact doesn't directly involve communicating with them. Like, so even if they're not the audience, they may be influential. And likewise, people may be impacted by the engagement you're doing and the kind of impact work you're doing, even if they're not the direct audience. So the idea with this approach is to go beyond a kind of cartoon caricature of the landscape that you're trying to influence. So instead of just kind of imagining who are the relevant stakeholders here, who could be affected, who is influential, you start to put some flesh on the bones. You start to get some specifics about what's driving stakeholders in the area where you're trying to make a difference. So these are some of the questions that you can ask yourself when you go about doing a stakeholder analysis. You think about the organizations that could be relevant. You think about their level of likely interest in your work, in the engagement that you're planning to do. Think about what aspects of the work are likely to be of interest or not. And what level of influence might these organizations have on your ability to generate a societal impact to either block or enable? So this is a simple way of thinking through who are the relevant parties for your attempt to develop societal impact. And the two categories where you can score from low to high, this gives you a simple way of prioritizing. So you could, for example, prioritize the high interest, high influence as the kind of place to focus because that's where you're going to make the biggest difference. But sometimes you may also need the third dimension of impact, who is most impacted, to think about as well. So these kinds of questions are things that are worth thinking through when you go to develop an impact plan. We were just talking in one of the groups about the way that stakeholder analysis fits into the impact planning process. And often it's not done when people are doing impact planning. And I and Mark Reed, we both think that it's an important thing to add into the process at an early stage because it keeps you from narrowing too strongly right away, where there may be important pathways to impact, there may be important stakeholders that if you started from a kind of broad sweep thinking about who are the range of relevant parties, it kind of keeps your thinking wider and more open before you narrow down. And once you do start narrowing down in a logic model or a theory of change, you've done that initial thinking about and mapping of relevant parties so that you can draw those in to create a more sophisticated theory of change or logic model down the line. So this is something that is not a standard practice currently, but it's something that that Mark Reed and I are advocating should be a standard practice going forward. The bottom line here, like the benefit, the goal is to take a strategic approach. So the idea is that we're trying to develop a strategic approach to doing this kind of work. That means that we choose an approach in full recognition of what are the benefits and the limitations of choosing to engage and work to develop societal impact in one way and not another way. That we're always making those choices aware of what we're giving up and what we're gaining. That's really what it means to take a strategic approach. So, another element in impact planning is to think about your impact objectives. So, to be very explicit about what is it exactly that you're trying to achieve with your impact plans. So, what kinds of change do you want to see? And this is another step in the process of developing a strategic plan for how you're going to develop societal impact. So, thinking about specifically in a clear and measurable way, talking about what your objectives are and reminding yourself of these in a way that they're top of mind, they're kind of a guiding light, a kind of North Star through the process of developing societal impact. Because it's easy to get distracted as you're going through the process by, the practicalities of the day, by whatever is kind of the thing you're used to doing. And so it's important to keep a focus on the impact objectives and then to think strategically about what are you, or in this case, the people you're supporting, what are they best positioned to do? What is it that they are the best position to do in terms of developing impact, as opposed to something that anybody could do? So, one of the important distinctions that comes in at this stage in the impact planning process, and we'll come back again when we talk about evaluation, is the distinction between outputs and outcomes. Outputs versus outcomes. And these are often conflated. So when you ask about what is a person or organization aiming to achieve, a lot of times they will simply describe outputs. They will say, we are trying to deliver 5 workshops, or we're going to create 2 policy briefs and 1 press release. These are just outputs. These are means to an end. The outcome is the change that's supposed to be developed based on those outputs. So the real focus when we're thinking about impact should be on outcomes, on actual changes, on differences, on what is it that's supposed to be different because this engagement activity took place. And there may be several different ways to get to that outcome. And we want to think through an evidence-based or strategic approach. We're trying to choose the most effective way to get to those targeted outcomes. So it's really important to be clear on what are the targeted outcomes. What is it that's supposed to be different? Not just I did 5 workshops, but why? What was that supposed to change? And for whom? So in this process of clarifying impact objectives, it's very important to be as specific as possible in terms of both who exactly is supposed to be benefiting, what exactly are the changes that are supposed to be developed, and as clear and explicit as possible so that anybody who read that impact objective description would interpret it in the same way, as opposed to kind of a vague, abstract kind of description, like raising awareness of particle accelerators or something that could mean many different things, specifically. Point of being specific is that it lets you get into a way of planning that can actually be successful. So what you want to try to avoid is these gaps that you get between, I want to raise awareness of the importance of trustable AI, for example, and then I'm giving a webinar, with the general public. There needs to be some kind of connecting tissue between the specific thing that you're doing and that big picture goal. And so it's totally fine if you have intermediate level goals that are on the way to that much bigger, kind of goal. That's fine. You don't have to kind of squeeze everything in, but the level that people often struggle with is the kind of, what is my specific project, program, activity? What is that realistically going to achieve? If everything goes really well, what can it realistically achieve? Being able to connect that answer to the bigger picture is great. That's also important, but at a minimum, it's important to be able to be realistic, because then you can think realistically about what is the best way to get there. So you can be targeted in your approach to designing a public engagement program, to developing impact. And targeted approaches are much more likely to be successful. So, two more concepts to introduce here for this session focusing on impact planning. First is logic model, and the second is theory of change. And these are related concepts. These are tools that are used for planning for impact. So I'm going to show you what they look like and talk about the difference between them a little bit. But essentially, they both allow you to clarify your research plan and what the kind of logical steps are to get to the outcomes that you're aiming for. They help you to clarify whether the approach that you're planning to take is the most realistic, is the most strategic, is it the best way to get to the outcomes you're aiming for. So it helps you to lay out your plan in a way that lets you interrogate, is it the best structure? Are there some, and reflect on, are there some ways this could be improved? So those are the key benefits to these tools. I'll first introduce the logic model. And the traditional logic model is pretty bare. It's a very simple structure. And I think we need something a little bit more complicated than that for when we're planning for impact. So I'll show you my version of the logic model, but the kinds of questions that you're answering is, what does success look like? If everything's working really well, what would people be doing? What would they be saying? So when we think about a public engagement activity, think tangibly about what kinds of effects we would expect. So this is a more differentiated logic model than the traditional one. And basically you describe your activity, you describe how it is going to be delivered. So for example, maybe it's going to be participatory, where you're involving those that you're aiming to benefit, or maybe it's going to be an interactive structure. Whatever your delivery methods are, you articulate that in the second column. And then you think about, what kinds of effects is this supposed to have? How should people be responding initially if this is going well? And then how does that connect to the intended outcomes of the project or program? So, and then you can potentially connect that to an even wider institutional level impact goals that go beyond the project or the program level. So this is what I call an impact logic model. And I've used this approach with, for example, with the National Gallery in London to help them map out their various programs aimed at external audiences and to clarify their impact goals. This can be a helpful kind of straightforward way of representing what the plan is for getting to impact. It can also look like a theory of change to do something similar. A theory of change is kind of like an impact logic model that's broken out of its linear kind of horizontal structure into potentially lots of different complicated pathways to get to impact. So a theory of change, I'll show you an example in a second, is a comprehensive description of how and why the change that you're targeting, the societal impact that you want to see, is supposed to be developing. So what is the plan exactly? The idea is to not have any missing middle in your plan, where you jump from something relatively straightforward, simple kind of activity at a small scale to a kind of giant goal, and you don't articulate how the smaller steps get to the bigger point, which means it probably isn't going to happen. So a theory of change is designed to help you think systematically about the steps involved to deliver impact by showing how and why particular parts of an impact plan will develop the specific impacts that you're targeting. So the kinds of questions you ask yourself with a theory of change are, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Who are you trying to reach? How are you going to reach those people that you're trying to engage? What is it that you have to offer them that they care about? What is your way in? And what are the outcomes that you're aiming to develop? And then the part that's distinctive about a theory of change is what are the steps that are needed to bring about the change? All of the steps. So not just I did a workshop and and health inequality dropped by 40%, but what are all of the steps to get to that intended outcome? And one of the benefits of doing this is it helps to highlight alternative pathways, other ways you could go about developing impact, and it helps you to kind of think strategically in this impact planning process. So theory of change is a widely used tool, and it's growing every year, more and more widely used. It started most intensively in the development sector, and now it's really spread pretty widely. So in an ideal scenario, to kind of connect back to where we started, you would be using a kind of stakeholder engagement process to co-produce a theory of change. So you develop your theory of change in a way where you're kind of checking with those who are supposed to be involved in that theory of change. And this can help you to make sure that your plans are not kind of wildly off base. You don't have assumptions that aren't actually going to match reality by getting some external feedback on your theory of change. But at minimum, this does expose, even if you don't have the time and resources to do that, to get external input, you still benefit from writing down what the plan is so that you can show every step that's needed to get to the outcomes that you're targeting. These are the kind of inputs that you need for a theory of change. So you need information about what is the problem you're trying to solve, who is your key audience, what is your way in to reaching that audience, what are the steps needed to bring about your targeted change, what are the measurable effects that you should be able to see from each of these steps, and how does this connect to wider long-term benefits? So the idea with a theory of change and in general a kind of evidence-based approach is that you don't find yourself investing years of effort going down one road that actually did not lead anywhere, that actually was a dead end. You were never going to be successful going that way. It was just that it hadn't been planned out sufficiently in advance. And I've seen this so many times, people investing decades in pathways that are just never going to deliver the intended impact goals because they weren't planned out every step. They're missing pieces, they're missing middle in their plans. So this is just an example to kind of show what this can look like from a project I did in Scotland with a research center focusing on water. So this theory of change is for a particular project that they supported in this research center focusing on surface water flooding, surface water flood forecasting. So you can see the kind of complexity that you can end up with in a theory of change, much more complicated than a logic model representation. And what this is showing in red are the impact activities. So these were the kind of initiating steps to develop impact. So things like engaging a steering committee, involving potential policy users of the research results at an early stage, the actual report and how the information is relayed on the website. These are all impact activities. And then they connect up with enabling factors, that's in yellow. So these are factors that help to influence whether those activities are successful. So for example, just because you have a report doesn't mean the important people are going to read it. So then an enabling factor is that stakeholders who are in a position of influence amplify the research findings and make sure that they're seen by those who can actually use them. And then intermediate outcomes are shown in blue. So these are the intermediate steps on the way to those big picture end goals that they would like to get to at the end, which are things like, that's in the kind of green turquoise. Emergency services informed when there is surface water flooding disrupting routes. Glasgow more prepared to detect flood risks and alert relevant local authorities. So these are those kind of big picture end goals, like major differences that are made at the end of the story. But the pathway to get there can be a little bit complicated to be successful. So the bottom line in doing this kind of thing is it provides you with a strategic approach, which means that you don't find yourself making problematic decisions where your probability of success is low. You can avoid wasting resources on pathways to impact that lead nowhere, that actually are leading to dead ends. And sometimes you have what could be an excellent model for impacting, excellent plan. It's just got one little missing piece. Like I've seen that a number of times where there was just a key stakeholder group that was missing from the process, that once they were activated, once that extra piece was added, then the impact plan works. So all of these things can be uncovered when you take an evidence-based approach. So that's it for impact planning.